Before we begin this story of a man who nearly lost everything and a woman who had already lost it all, I want to ask you something. Have you ever made a decision so desperate, so stripped of pride that you couldn't tell anyone about it? Not a friend, not a brother, not God himself, if he happened to be listening. That's where Mason Cole was on the morning of September 3rd, 1887, standing in a lawyer's office in Sheridan, Wyoming, holding a piece of paper that told him he had 30 days to find a wife or forfeit the only thing he had ever built with his own two hands. And somewhere in Chicago at that exact same hour, Hazel Donnelly was stepping off a streetcar in the rain with a carpet bag in one hand and a train ticket in the other, looking over her shoulder for the third time in 20 minutes. She wasn't running from the law. She was running from the men who owned it. This is the story of how two people fleeing opposite disasters found each other at the edge of the world and decided for reasons neither could fully explain to stop running. If this story moves you, please hit that like button and leave your city in the comments. I want to see how far Mason and Hazel's story travels. Now, let's go back to where it began. The cold bargain, she came with nothing but secrets and saved everything he built. The lawyer's name was Aldous Briggs, and he had the kind of face that made men feel guilty for things they hadn't done yet. He was 60, possibly older, with wire spectacles that sat too low on his nose, and a habit of pressing his fingertips together when he delivered bad news as if he were praying for the person sitting across from him rather than destroying them. Mason Cole sat in the chair across from that desk and felt the ground beneath him tilt. The Territorial Homestead Revision of 1885, Briggs said, is quite clear on the matter. Section 14, paragraph 3. A claimant of 100 acres or more must demonstrate evidence of permanent family settlement within 7 years of initial filing. A single male residing without dependent family members does not satisfy this requirement under the revised statute. Mason stared at him. I've been on that land for 7 years. I built every structure on it. I dug the well. I laid the fencing. 7 years. Yes, Briggs pressed his fingertips together. And I'm sorry, Mr. Cole, but the revision was passed in March. The Territorial Land Office has begun enforcement. You have 30 days to satisfy the family requirement or your claim reverts. To who? Briggs hesitated. Just a fraction of a second, but Mason had grown up reading silences the way other men read signposts. He'd learned that skill young in a family where what wasn't said was always more dangerous than what was. The claim would be reassigned, Briggs said carefully, to another applicant who meets the full requirements. Harlan Voss has already filed, hasn't he? Not a question. The air in the room changed when he said the name. Briggs's fingertips pressed harder, together. I cannot discuss other parties' filings, Mr. Cole. Mason stood. The chair scraped back against the wooden floor, loud as a gunshot in the quiet office. He picked up his hat from the desk, turned it once in his hands, and set it on his head. 30 days, he said. 30 days. He walked out into the September sunlight, and the world looked exactly as it had an hour ago. The wide main street of Sheridan dust rising from the wheels of a passing freight wagon, a dog sleeping in the shade of the mercantile porch, and yet it felt entirely different, as if someone had moved all the furniture 1 inch to the left while he wasn't looking. Nothing broken, nothing missing, but nothing quite where it should be. He stood on the sidewalk for a long moment. 7 years. He had come to Wyoming with $17 a mule named Calhoun, who died the second winter, and a wound in his chest that had nothing to do with his body. 7 years of hauling timber, digging ditches, mending fence in weather that tried to kill him every third month. The Coldwater Creek property, 240 acres in the foothills north of Sheridan, with a spring that ran year-round and soil dark enough to grow almost anything if you coaxed it right, was not just his livelihood. It was the only answer he had ever given to a question that had been eating him alive since 1879. The question being, what do you do with a grief that doesn't have a name? His brother Thomas had died in a coal mine collapse in Western Virginia. The official report called it a structural failure caused by accelerated excavation. Mason had read that report 4 times and spent 3 years trying to get anyone official to acknowledge what he already knew. In his bones, the accelerated excavation had been ordered by Harlan Voss, who owned the mine and who had been in a hurry to reach a lower seam before winter set the ground too hard to work. Thomas had been 24 years old. He'd had a girl he was planning to marry and a laugh that you could hear from 2 houses away. Mason had left Virginia because staying meant either wasting the rest of his life in pointless rage or doing something he would hang for. He'd come to Wyoming to build something instead of destroying something. And now Harlan Voss, who had moved his operation west after the Virginia mine was quietly sold to a different holding company, was going to take that too. Mason walked to his horse, untied the reins from the hitching post, swung into the saddle. He needed to think, and he thought best moving with the wide Wyoming sky above him and nothing in particular to look at. He rode north toward home. He rode for an hour before he admitted to himself what he was going to have to do. The telegraph office in Sheridan occupied the back corner of the dry goods store, operated by a man named Weaver, who asked no questions and remembered everything. Mason had used it twice in 7 years, once to notify a cattle buyer in Cheyenne about a sale, and once to send word to his mother in Virginia that he was alive and intended to stay that way. He stood in front of Weaver's window for a full 3 minutes before he spoke. "I need to send a message," he said, "to a placement agency, back east." Weaver looked up from his ledger. He had the good grace to show no particular expression. "Which agency?" Mason pulled a folded piece of paper from his vest pocket. He'd stopped at Briggs's office on his way out to ask this very question, swallowing every instinct he had while the lawyer wrote down 2 names. "Continental Placement Services, New York." Weaver wrote it down. Message. Mason had composed it on the ride back, turning the words over until they felt as honest as he could make them, which meant stripped of everything unnecessary, because unnecessary things tended to be the ones that lied. Wyoming rancher 36 seeks practical woman for legal homestead marriage. Immediate placement required. 240 acres spring water sound structures. Offer partnership in ranch operation. Separate accommodation, fair treatment. No romantic expectations. Immediate travel required. Reply to Mason Cole, Sheridan, Wyoming. Weaver wrote it without comment. The total cost was 60 cents. Mason paid it and walked back to his horse, feeling like a man who had just pawned something he'd never get back. 3 days passed. On the 4th morning, he rode into town and found a reply waiting. The agency's telegram was brief. 1 candidate available for immediate Western placement. Donnelly H., age 34, Chicago. References available. Bookkeeping and farm background. Departure possible within 10 days. Confirm interest and we will arrange travel. Mason read it twice. A woman from Chicago, 34. He tried to picture it, a city woman, probably soft-handed, probably used to gas lamps and paved streets and coffee shops, and stopped trying. It didn't matter what she was used to. What mattered was whether she was willing to work and honest about her expectations. He sent confirmation that afternoon. 2 weeks later, he got a follow-up telegram. Donnelly arrived Sheridan September 19th afternoon train. September 19th gave him 4 days after her arrival to file the marriage certificate before his 30-day window expired. 4 days. Mason rode home and spent the next 2 weeks preparing the ranch with the same methodical attention he gave to preparing for winter, because that was what this was, in a sense. Preparation for a long season he couldn't entirely predict. He built a second bedroom in the back of the house, framing it out of the same rough timber he'd used for the original structure, plastering the walls with a lime mixture he mixed himself. He installed a window on the east wall so whoever slept there would get the morning light. He found a second washstand at the dry goods store and a decent mattress from the widow Halverson, who was selling off furniture she no longer needed. Eric Halverson, his closest neighbor, a Norwegian immigrant who'd been working the land 12 miles south for nearly as long as Mason came by, midway through the preparations, and stood in the doorway of the new room without saying anything for a moment. "You're getting married," Eric said finally. "Apparently." "To who?" "I don't know yet." Eric considered this. He was a big man, quietly built, with the kind of patience in his face that came from spending a lot of years watching weather. "My Ruth did not know me when she agreed to come from Stavanger," he said. "She knew my letter. My letter was honest. I was also honest. It worked. Your letter probably included the fact that you had a sense of humor. My letter said I had good teeth and no criminal record. She came anyway." Eric picked up one of the spare boards from the floor, turned it over in his hands. "You need help with the east fence before she arrives. I can come Thursday." That was all he said about it. Mason was grateful in a way he didn't know how to express and didn't try to. The rain had been falling for 3 hours by the time Hazel Donnelly reached the telegraph office on Michigan Avenue, and she was soaked through despite the umbrella that had turned inside out somewhere near the river. She stood in the doorway of the office, a small lit room that smelled of ink and coal smoke, and read the confirmation telegram one more time. Placement confirmed. Colum, Sheridan, Wyoming. Departs September 17th. Chicago and Northwestern to Cheyenne, connecting to Sheridan. Travel documents enclosed. She folded the telegram carefully and placed it in the inside pocket of her coat close to her body, the way you carry something you can't afford to lose. Then she stood very still for a moment and let herself feel the full weight of what she was doing. She was 34 years old. She had a degree in accounting from the Illinois Institute of Commerce, one of 12 women in her class, a fact that the Institute's catalog had noted with what she'd always recognized as reluctant pride. She had worked for 9 years at Meridian Capital, a financial services firm, in the loop, rising from junior bookkeeper to senior accounts analyst. She had been, by every measure she understood, good at her job. She had been too good at her job. 18 months ago, she had noticed something in the quarterly reconciliation reports. A pattern of wire transfers, small amounts carefully spaced, routed through 3 different subsidiary accounts, before disappearing into a holding company called Western Land Development Associates. The amounts were modest enough to avoid internal audit flags, but across 4 years of records, they totaled something north of $400,000. She had brought it to her supervisor. Her supervisor had brought it to the senior partner. The senior partner had told her she was mistaken. 2 weeks later, she had been served with papers accusing her of falsifying company records, a fabricated charge, but one with enough manufactured documentation behind it to make a real legal fight expensive and uncertain. The firm behind Western Land Development Associates was Voss Consolidated Holdings. She had not known that name when she found the transfers. She knew it very well by the time she understood what she'd stumbled into. Harlan Voss. She had researched him obsessively over the subsequent months, in the hours after work, and on weekends in the reading room of the Chicago Public Library, where no one would think to look for her. A man who had made his first money in Virginia coal mining in the 1870s, who had moved his operations progressively westward, who had a gift for appearing as a legitimate businessman while quietly destroying the financial foundations of anyone who stood between him and what he wanted, who Hazel had eventually discovered, done to her father's small accounting firm in 1881, what he apparently did to everything, found its vulnerabilities, manufactured a crisis, then purchased the collapsed remnants for pennies on the dollar. Her father had died 2 years after losing the firm. Officially, the death certificate said heart failure. Hazel knew better. She had found the letter he'd left, 3 sentences in his careful accountant's handwriting, folded inside the back cover of his business ledger, where she hadn't found it until she was cleaning out his desk. She had read it once. She had never been able to read it again. She did not talk about how her father died. Not to her brother, who had his own grief and his own way of managing it. Not to anyone. She had kept the letter. She didn't know why. It lived at the bottom of her carpet bag, inside a leather portfolio, with the rest of the documents she was taking to Wyoming, because she was not whatever else. She was the kind of woman who abandoned evidence. The legal case against her in Chicago was still pending. The detective assigned to locate her, a man named Raymond Porter, who worked out of the Pinkerton office on Wabash, had been making inquiries at her rooming house for 3 weeks. She had 1 week, perhaps 2, before his inquiries became something more concrete. The placement agency had seemed at first like a desperate option. Then it had seemed like the only option. Then when she sat down and thought about it with the clear-eyed, analytical mind that had served her for 9 years at Meridian Capital, it had seemed like a reasonable option. A legal marriage in Wyoming, far from Chicago's jurisdictional reach. A roof over her head. Time to finish organizing the evidence she'd collected, evidence that, properly compiled and presented, could bring down not just the Chicago charges against her, but the entire Voss operation. The man she'd be marrying, a rancher named Mason Cole, had described what he was offering with the bluntness she respected: partnership, separate accommodation, fair treatment, no romantic expectations. Hazel had read that telegram 4 times and felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight for a long time. No false promises. No performance required. She could work with that. She collected her travel documents, walked back into the rain, and began making her way to her rooming house to finish packing. She did not look over her shoulder this time. She was done with looking backward. The Sheridan station was smaller than anything Hazel had imagined. A single platform, a water tower, four men standing in various attitudes of waiting. She stepped down from the train car with her large trunk and her carpet bag, and the September air hit her like cold water, clean and sharp, and smelling of pine, and something she couldn't quite name. Altitude, maybe. The particular quality of air that hadn't traveled through 2 million people before reaching your lungs. She stood on the platform and looked at the four men waiting. Three of them were clearly waiting for freight. The fourth, he was standing apart from the others against the station wall, with his hat pulled low and a stillness about him that was different from simple patience. More like the stillness of a man who had learned to take up exactly the space he needed and no more. He was taller than she'd expected and younger looking than 36. Broad through the shoulders, lean in the way of men who work hard outdoors rather than men who go without eating. His face was angular and weathered with the particular creases around the eyes that came from years of squinting into western sun and wind. He was looking at her. She was looking at him. She picked up her carpet bag and walked directly to him. "Mr. Cole." "Miss Donnelly." He touched his hat brim, a pause. "You're sooner than I expected off the train." "I travel light." She looked at him steadily. "I have a trunk." He moved past her to where the freight handlers were unloading. Her trunk was substantial. She knew heavier than it looked, and she watched him lift it without apparent difficulty and carry it toward a wagon hitched to a patient-looking roan horse. While he was occupied, Hazel took a breath and looked at the town. Main Street running perpendicular to the rail line. False front buildings, a church with a new-looking steeple, a mercantile that appeared to stock most of what the territory needed. Mountains visible in three directions, closer than she'd realized from the maps. She had studied Wyoming extensively in the library over the past 2 months. She'd wanted to know what she was going into. She was beginning to understand that knowing things on paper and knowing them in your bones were different categories of knowledge. Mason Cole returned. He stood a few feet away and studied her with an expression that was neither warm nor cold, measuring, she thought. The way you look at a new piece of machinery, trying to understand how it fits into the work you needed to do. She didn't mind being assessed. She'd assessed people herself. It was how you survived. "The ride to the ranch is about 2 hours," he said. "It'll be dark before we arrive." "That's fine. I want to say something before we go." He said it in the same tone he might use to discuss the weather, direct matter of fact. "I sent that telegram honestly. I'm not looking for a performance. I'm not looking for a wife in the traditional sense. What I need is someone who can occupy the legal definition of the word long enough to keep the land claim intact. I'll provide room board and fair compensation for any work you contribute. Your privacy will be respected entirely." Hazel looked at him. "I sent my reply honestly too," she said. "I'm not looking for a performance either. I'm looking for a place to work in peace. I have skills that will be useful to you. I intend to use them." When she paused. "I also have some things in my past that are complicated. I'll tell you about them when I've decided how. I'm not trying to deceive you. I'm trying to be honest about the fact that the honesty will take some time." Something shifted in his expression. Not suspicion, closer to recognition. The look of a man who understood complicated pasts from the inside. "Fair enough," and he said. "I have some of those myself." He helped her onto the wagon seat and climbed up beside her. They pulled out of the station as the sun began its descent toward the western ridge, painting the dusk golden. For a while, neither of them spoke. The landscape opened around them, rolling grassland giving way to foothills, the mountains darkening against the sky. It was, Hazel thought, the most space she had ever been inside of. Chicago had buildings that blocked the horizon in every direction. Here the horizon just went on. "That's the Halverson place," Mason said, eventually pointing to a cluster of buildings a mile to the south. "Eric Halverson. He'll be friendly if you want that. He won't push if you don't. And the property to the north, a different quality of silence. That's Voss Consolidated Range, about 12,000 acres extending east of the canyon." Hazel's hands tightened very slightly on the carpet bag in her lap. "Harlan Voss," she said, carefully neutral. "Testing. You've heard of him?" "I've heard the name. He's been buying up land in this territory for 3 years. He owns everything east of the ridge and is working on the rest." The tone was flat, controlled, but Hazel had spent 9 years reading financial documents and the human beings who produced them. She could hear the thing underneath the flatness. He's the reason I needed to file a marriage claim. He's the reason the homestead revision got pushed through the territorial legislature in the first place. Hazel sat with that for a moment. You think he lobbied for the revision specifically to force out single male claimants? I think it's one interpretation of why a land revision suddenly became law after a decade of no changes right around the time Voss started moving into this county. He glanced at her sideways. Why you have another interpretation? I have questions, she said. I'd like to see the property records when I can. Another silence. Then you were a bookkeeper. Senior accounts analyst, yes. He looked at her again, a longer look, this time something reassessing in it. Briggs, my lawyer, has copies of the county filings. I have my own records going back to the original claim. I'd like to see all of it. The ranch appeared as they came over a low-rise buildings in a valley, a creek catching the last of the light, dark pine on the slopes above. It was smaller than she'd pictured and more solid. The house was adobe and timber low and wide, with a covered porch running the full front length, a barn, a smokehouse, a corral with 3 horses that raised their heads as the wagon approached. It was not pretty. It was not the kind of place that appeared in women's magazines or railroad promotional pamphlets. It was the kind of place that had been built to survive, and it looked exactly like that, capable, undecorated, and permanent. Hazel felt something in her chest that she couldn't immediately identify. Later, lying in the darkness of her new room, east-facing window, good mattress walls that smelled of fresh plaster, she identified it. It felt like the first breath after a very long time of breathing shallowly. They were married on September 21st in the same church in Sheridan, where Mason had registered his original land claim 7 years earlier. The minister was a young man named Reverend Aldrich, who performed the ceremony with a slightly puzzled air of someone being asked to bless an arrangement he didn't fully understand. The witness was Eric Halverson, who brought his wife Ruth. Ruth was a compact, sharp-eyed Norwegian woman who shook Hazel's hand after the ceremony with the grip of someone accustomed to honest assessment and apparently satisfied with what she found. "You'll do," Ruth said. It was the nicest thing anyone had said to Hazel in several months. The certificate was filed that afternoon. Mason's claim was safe. The relief on his face visible for exactly 3 seconds before he composed it back into the neutral expression he wore habitually told Hazel more about what the stakes had been than anything he'd said. They drove home in the quiet of late afternoon. That evening, Hazel made supper from what the larder held: salt pork, dried beans, the last of some apples she'd found in a box in the pantry. It wasn't much, but she cooked it carefully, and Mason ate with the particular attention of a man who has been eating his own indifferent cooking for too long. "We need supplies," she said. "I was in town 2 weeks ago." "You need to go again. I've inventoried the larder." She produced a list written on the back of an envelope in her precise small handwriting. "Also, I'll need access to your account books." He looked at the list, looked at her. "Why?" "Because that's what I do. I look at numbers and find out what they mean." She met his eyes. "You hired a bookkeeper, Mr. Cole. Let me keep books." A pause. Not reluctance exactly, more like a man deciding whether to trust a bridge he hasn't tested yet. Then he stood and went to the shelf above the fireplace and took down a battered ledger. "There's another one from last year in the drawer," he said, "and the one before that in the chest under the window." Hazel opened the current ledger and began reading. She read for 2 hours that first night, while Mason cleaned a rifle at the other end of the table and the fire in the stove crackled between them. She didn't speak, and he didn't interrupt her, and it was, she thought, one of the more comfortable silences she had spent with another person in recent memory. What she found in the ledger was the portrait of a man who had built something real from nothing and had been systematically, quietly undermined for at least 3 years. The pattern was subtle. She'd seen similar patterns in the Meridian Capital records, but once you knew what to look for, it was unmistakable. Feed costs 18% above the regional average, every purchase, every supplier in the county. Cattle prices he was selling at consistently $6 to $8 per horse head below what the market data suggested he should be getting. Equipment repairs, small incidents scattered across 3 years, each one manageable in isolation, but adding up to a chronic drain on operating capital. She didn't say anything that night. She needed more data. But she lay awake for a long time after she'd retired to her room, staring at the ceiling, thinking about patterns and the people who made them. Ruth Halverson arrived 3 days after the wedding with a loaf of dark bread, a crock of butter, and an opinion about everything. Hazel liked her immediately. They sat at the kitchen table while Mason and Eric walked the east fence line, a weekly patrol. Mason apparently never skipped, and Ruth watched Hazel work through the second ledger with the focused attention of someone evaluating a new employee. "You read numbers like most people read a face," Ruth said. "Numbers don't lie," Hazel said. "People sometimes do. Numbers are just the record of what people did." "What do Mason's numbers say?" Hazel looked up. Ruth's eyes were direct and patient, the eyes of a woman who asked questions she actually wanted answers to. "They say someone's been working very hard to keep this ranch just barely profitable," Hazel said. "Not unprofitable, that would be too obvious. Just barely profitable so that any bad season or unexpected cost tips the balance and makes selling look reasonable." Ruth was quiet for a moment. "You know about Voss?" "I know of him. He's been at this for 3 years. Bought out 2 ranches to the east, the Kemper family and old Joseph Strand. Both of them after small disasters that looked like bad luck." Ruth's voice was even, but her hands were still on the table. "My Eric thinks Voss has someone inside the County Merchants Association, someone who keeps prices moving in the right direction for Voss's interests." Hazel nodded slowly. "That would explain the feed costs. Consistent overcharging across all suppliers means either a cartel arrangement or someone coordinating pricing." "Can you prove it?" "If I can get the regional price indices and compare them to what Masons have been paying, I can demonstrate the pattern. Whether that's proof in a legal sense," she paused. "It's enough to present to other ranchers. It's enough to make the case that this isn't bad luck." Ruth looked at her for a long moment. "Mason doesn't talk to other ranchers," she said. "He doesn't talk to people in general if he can avoid it. He's a good man and he'd give you his last dollar if you needed it, but he prefers to solve his own problems alone." "That's usually how people like Voss win," Hazel said. Ruth's expression shifted into something that might have been a smile. "You know," she said, "when Eric told me Mason was getting a mail-order bride, I was worried. And now I think Mason may have gotten the better end of this particular bargain." She pushed the buster crock across the table. "Have some bread, then tell me what you need and where I can help." Mason was checking the third post on the east fence line when he noticed it. The wire had been cut and retwisted carefully with the kind of attention to detail that was meant to not be noticed. But he'd set this fence himself, and he knew the way the wire sat against the post. Someone had been through here, cut the wire, done something on the other side, and refastened it. He walked the line for another quarter-mile, Eric moving parallel on the far side. He found 2 more places where the wire had been worked. "Survey markers," Eric said when they met up. He was holding something, a small metal stake he'd found in the grass 20 yards inside the fence line on Mason's side of the boundary. Mason turned it over in his hands. "Plain metal, no marking." "How many?" "I found 3. "Who puts survey markers inside an established fence line?" "Someone who's planning to argue that the fence is in the wrong place." Eric's face was still. "Voss had a surveyor in the county 2 weeks ago. I saw his wagon on the main road." Mason stood very still for a moment, looking at the marker. A surveyor, a new survey. And if that survey came back showing the east fence was 10 or 20 yards too far east, if Voss had a piece of paper saying the boundary was different from what 7 years of established use said it was, then he'd have legal cover to press a property dispute. Not just a nuisance, a legitimate mechanism for tying up the ranch in territorial court proceedings while the operating costs continued to drain Mason's capital. It was a slow strangulation. Methodical. Patient. The same pattern that had killed Joseph Strand's will to fight. The same pattern that had convinced the Kemper family to sell. "Pull the markers," Mason said. "All of them. Every one you find." He rode home with the stakes in his saddlebag and the beginning of something cold and clear, moving through his thinking. He'd been managing this situation alone for 3 years, doing what he always did, putting his head down, working harder, treating each problem as a separate problem. Hazel had been on the ranch for 6 days. In 6 days, she had reorganized his accounts, identified systematic price manipulation, and was already asking questions that had taken him 3 years to even begin to formulate properly. He unsaddled his horse and stood in the barn for a long moment thinking. Then he went inside. Hazel was at the table with the ledgers spread in front of her and a sheet of paper covered in her small, precise handwriting. She looked up when he came in. He set one of the survey markers on the table in front of her. She picked it up, studied it, put it down. "Where did you find it?" she asked. "20 yards inside my east fence line. 3 of them. Eric found more." She was quiet for a moment, her thumb moving along the edge of the marker. "He's going to file a boundary dispute. That's my read. If he does, you'll need documentation. Maps the original survey, sworn statements from neighbors who know where the line has always been." She looked up. "And you'll need it before he files, not after. Once he files, the process controls the timeline and the nyam. How do you know how territorial land disputes work?" Something moved across her face very briefly there and gone. "I've read about similar cases," she said carefully. He looked at her steadily. She met his gaze without flinching, but he could see her deciding something, measuring something. "You said you'd tell me about your complicated past when you decided how," he said. "I did say that. I'm not pushing. I'm just saying I found 3 survey markers on my land today that weren't there last week. If there's anything you know about how Voss operates that would help me understand what's coming, I'd like to know it." A long pause. The fire crackled in the stove. Outside, the wind was picking up the particular sound of Wyoming wind, higher and cleaner than the wind off Lake Michigan that Hazel had heard every winter of her Chicago life. "Give me another day," she said. "I need to organize some things first." "All right." He cooked supper that night she'd been cooking every night so far, and it didn't seem fair, and they ate in comfortable silence. And afterwards, she went back to her ledgers, and he sharpened tools that didn't really need sharpening, and neither of them said anything else about it. But Mason lay awake later, listening to the Wyoming wind, thinking about what kind of woman chose flight to a stranger's ranch over whatever she'd been running from, and what kind of man she must have been running from. 2 nights after Mason found the survey markers, he came back to the house late from checking the stock. A heifer had been off her feed, and he'd wanted to watch her through the evening and found the house quiet. The lamp was still burning in the main room. Hazel was sitting at the table, but she wasn't working. The ledgers were pushed to one side, and she was holding a piece of paper in both hands, reading it. Or not reading it, she knew what it said, that much was clear. She was just holding it. Her face was turned slightly away from him. He could see the line of her jaw, the set of her shoulders. He'd seen that posture before, in a mirror mostly, the posture of a person sitting with something that has no comfortable position. He didn't say anything. He went to the stove, found the coffee, still warm, poured 2 cups, set one on the table next to her quietly without a word, and took his own to the window. He stood with his back to her, looking out at the dark yard, drinking his coffee. After a while, he heard her fold the paper, the small sound of it being placed somewhere careful. "Thank you," she said. He turned around. She had both hands wrapped around the coffee cup, and her expression was composed. She was very good at composing her expression. He'd noticed that already, but there was something around her eyes that hadn't been there before. "My father was an accountant," she said. "In Chicago, he had a small firm, 3 employees, mostly small business clients. He was careful and honest and good at his work." Mason listened. He didn't sit down. He leaned against the wall, and the distance felt appropriate. In 1881, one of his largest clients was a holding company that was in the process of being restructured. My father handled their books during the transition. After the restructuring was complete, the holding company's parent organization accused him of misappropriating funds during the process. She was speaking quietly in the even tone of someone who has thought about something so many times that the emotion has been organized into a separate compartment. The accusation was false. My father had been meticulous. I've seen the records. But the parent organization had resources and legal connections that a small Chicago accounting firm couldn't match. The case dragged on for 4 years. By the time it was dismissed, the firm was gone. The reputation was gone. The savings were gone. What was the parent organization? She looked at him. Voss Consolidated. The name settled between them. He died in 1885, she continued. The death certificate says heart failure. A pause so brief you might have missed it. I don't argue with the death certificate. Mason was quiet for a moment. I'm sorry. When I found the same pattern in Meridian Capital's records, money moving through a Voss subsidiary, I thought I was doing the right thing by reporting it. I thought there were systems for this. That if you had evidence, the evidence meant something. Her voice was still even, but the edges were tighter now. The systems work for people like Voss. They work against people like my father. Like me. That's why you left Chicago. There's a detective from the Pinkerton office who's been looking for me. Raymond Porter. He was hired by Meridian to locate me, or that's the stated reason. I don't actually know who he reports to. She looked down at her coffee cup. For all I know, he's a Voss employee with a Pinkerton letterhead. Mason thought about the survey markers sitting in his saddlebag. About 7 years of systematically suppressed cattle prices. About Thomas, age 24, in a Virginia mine. The man you're running from, he said, is the same man I've been fighting since before I came to Wyoming. She looked up at him. Something shifted in her expression, not surprise exactly, but a recalibration. The look of someone adjusting a map because the territory has turned out to be different from the chart. His mine, Mason said, in Virginia. My brother was in it when it collapsed. A silence, long and full, and neither of them tried to fill it. So we're both, Hazel said finally, in the same war. We're in the same war. She was quiet for another moment. Then, I brought documents, everything I collected before I left Chicago, account records, internal memos, the original wire transfer records. I organized them, but I didn't have time to complete the analysis before I had to leave. She looked at him steadily. If I could finish the analysis here, cross-reference what I have from Chicago with what's happening in Wyoming, I think I could build something that Voss can't buy his way out of. Mason looked at his wife, this woman he'd known for 9 days who had arrived with a heavy trunk and a composed expression, and a grief she'd been carrying alone for years, and felt something shift in his own chest. Not the sharp, hot feeling of anger, which he knew well. Something different, steadier. Use whatever you need, he said. The table, the light, the time. Whatever you need. She nodded once. It wasn't thanks exactly, it was something more equal than thanks. Acknowledgement between two people who have arrived at the same ground from different directions. One more thing, she said. What? The detective who's looking for me. Raymond Porter. I don't know if he'll follow the trail to Wyoming, but if he does, she paused. I don't know whose side he's actually on. I need you to know that before you decide how to handle it if he shows up. Mason set down his coffee cup. If someone comes to this ranch looking for you, he said, they'll find out that you're my wife and this is your home. Anything after that is a conversation they can have with me first. She looked at him for a long moment. That's very, she stopped, started again. Thank you, Mr. Cole. Mason. A pause. Mason. He went to bed an hour later and lay in the dark listening to the wind and thought about the shape of the fight that was coming. It was bigger than a boundary dispute, bigger than a land claim. He was beginning to understand a reckoning that had been building for a long time in multiple places for multiple people. And for the first time in 7 years of fighting it alone, he was not fighting it alone. The first week of October brought cold nights and the smell of coming snow from the north, and Hazel Donnelly Cole, she had decided quietly and without announcement to use the name, work through it all, with the focused intensity of a woman who understood that time was a finite resource. She had taken over the far end of the kitchen table, which was the only flat surface large enough to spread multiple ledgers simultaneously. Mason had produced without comment every financial record the ranch had ever generated, 7 years of cattle sales, supply, purchases, equipment, costs, labor expenses, all of it in his careful, blocky handwriting in a series of battered ledgers. She had arranged them chronologically, made her own summary sheets, and begun the cross-referencing that had been half-finished in Chicago. The picture that emerged was almost elegant in its construction. She would have admired it professionally if it hadn't been designed to destroy a man's livelihood. Mason came in from the evening barn, check on the 5th night, to find her sitting back from the table for the first time in hours, staring at her own summary pages with an expression he'd learned to recognize, the look she wore when something that had been ambiguous had crystallized into clarity. He poured water from the pitcher, set a glass next to her without speaking, and waited. He's been working this county for 4 years, she said. Not 3, by any 4. The first year was preparation. He moved into the supply chains. County feed supplier, the main tack dealer in Sheridan, the largest livestock buyer who covers this region. She tapped the summary page. He doesn't own these businesses. He doesn't need to. He just needs relationships with the right people in each one. People who will adjust their prices on certain accounts, hold certain inventory steer, certain buyers away from certain sellers. What does he get out of it? Patience mainly. Voss is not in a hurry. He's been building this position for 4 years, suppressing profitability for 8 or 10 ranches in this county, not enough to drive them under, just enough to keep them vulnerable. Then when a drought year comes, or a rustling season, or a legal technicality, she looked at him. He already owns the valley. He just doesn't have the paperwork yet. Mason stood still for a moment. Can you prove the supply manipulation? I can demonstrate the pattern to the point where a reasonable person would have no other explanation. True legal proof would require testimony from the people doing the price adjustment. She paused, which they won't give voluntarily. But you can show the other ranchers what's been happening. Yes. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. Eric Halverson's been on that land for 12 years. He'll have records too. If his supply costs show the same pattern, that's what I need. His records and anyone else who will let me look. She leaned forward. I also need the territorial land records every sale Voss has made in this county. The official filings, the prices, the dates, because I think, she stopped, started again. I think there are some of those sales that won't bear close examination. What kind of close examination? The kind that compares the price paid with the financial situation of the seller in the months before the sale. She was choosing her words carefully, he noticed. Voss doesn't just wait for vulnerability. He creates it. And I think the timing of certain purchases, particularly the Kemper Ranch and the Strand property, will show that the crises that preceded those sales were not accidental. Mason looked at her. The lamplight made her face sharp and clear, the same way it made the Wyoming landscape sharp and clear. No softness, no decoration, nothing between you and what was actually there. The Kemper family, he said, their barn burned down 6 months before they sold. I know. Strand's cattle got a sickness, lost almost half his herd in one season. He was bankrupt within a year. I know that too. She held his gaze. Mason, there's something I have to tell you about Voss's operation in Chicago before we go further with this. He waited. The money that was moving through Meridian Capital, the transfers I found, some of it was coming from Wyoming, from this county. I didn't know that when I found the transfers. I was looking at it from the Chicago end, and the Wyoming origin was obscured by the subsidiary structure. She set her hands flat on the table. But when I left Chicago, I brought all the transfer records. I've been reconstructing the flow, and the Wyoming money is coming from a series of land transactions. Sales conducted at artificially depressed prices, which means Voss was acquiring assets significantly below market value and booking the difference through the subsidiary structure. So the land theft here is financing operations elsewhere, and vice versa. It's a self-sustaining system. Each acquisition funds the infrastructure for the next acquisition. She paused. It's the same thing he did to my father. He ran it through different mechanisms in Chicago, but the underlying logic is identical. Mason was quiet for a long moment. When did you figure this out? I had most of it pieced together before I left Chicago. I didn't know the Wyoming end of it was Sheridan County specifically until I saw your supply records and compared them to what I had. But you answered my telegram before you knew that. Yes, I answered your telegram because I needed to leave Chicago. That part was real. She met his eyes. But finding out that the man you've been fighting for 7 years is the same man who destroyed my father's life. A pause. I don't believe in coincidences of that magnitude. There's something operating here that's bigger than either of us understood when we came to it from different directions. Mason thought about Thomas, 24 years old, the sound of his laugh. We're going to need allies, he said. Yes. And a way to present this that doesn't just make us look like people with a grudge. I know. She looked at her summary pages. I've been thinking about structure. If we present this to the other ranchers first, show them the pattern in their own records, they become witnesses, not just supporters. Their testimony corroborates the documentary evidence. And if we then bring the combined case to the territorial authorities rather than just the county level, the county authorities are partially compromised. I've suspected that for a while. The federal level is harder to buy, especially if there's a newspaper involved. She said it almost carefully, watching his reaction. He was quiet for a moment. I know a man at the Sheridan Gazette, Tom Aldred. He's covered the land consolidation story twice and been told to drop it both times by his editor, who I assume has reasons for wanting it dropped. The editor isn't the only newspaper in the territory. No, he thought about it. There's the Cheyenne Tribune, and the territorial correspondent for the Denver Post covers Wyoming land issues. If we can get them a complete documented case, not rumors, not speculation, but the actual transfer records and the pricing pattern, they'll publish it. A story like this doesn't need a friendly editor, it needs evidence. She was right. He'd spent 3 years knowing he was being slowly dismantled and being unable to point to a single thing he could take to a court or a newspaper and say, this is what's being done to me. Having a name for the thing was different from being able to prove the thing. Hazel was offering him proof. All right, he said. Tomorrow we ride to Eric's. Eric Halverson's ledgers told the same story. Hazel sat at the Halverson kitchen table for 3 hours, with Ruth looking over her shoulder, and when she finished summarizing, Eric stood with his arms crossed in the doorway, looking at the numbers with the particular expression of a man who has suspected something for a long time and is not actually relieved to be proven right. 18% above market for feed, he said. 4 years. Consistently, there are no years where it equalizes, which rules out general inflation. This is targeted. The Strand property. Ruth was looking at Hazel's summary page, her finger on a particular line. Joseph sold in February, right after that terrible winter. She looked at Hazel. The winter his cattle got sick. Yes, I want to look at the cattle illness records if they exist. The timing. It was too fast, Eric said. He uncrossed his arms and came to the table. I'm a farmer, Mrs. Cole. I've seen cattle illness spread through a herd. What happened to Strand's cattle did not spread. It started in 3 places simultaneously. He looked at Mason. I said this at the time. Vody wanted to hear it. Who would want to hear it? Mason said quietly. To say something happened to Strand's cattle, you're accusing someone of doing it deliberately. You're accusing Voss specifically. And Voss has lawyers and money and... We're saying it now, Hazel said. She looked around the table. Not to the county authorities, not yet. But I want to start building a record of every incident that's happened in this county that could be attributed to deliberate sabotage rather than bad luck. Who else has experienced something like Strand? Something that in isolation looks like misfortune, but in context. The Lundgren family, Ruth said immediately. 2 years ago, irrigation ditch mysteriously collapsed. They lost their summer crop, sold 6 months later. And the Brennan homestead, Eric added, fire in the equipment barn, same year as Kemper's barn fire, different month. Hazel wrote it all down. By the time they left the Halverson ranch, she had the beginnings of a pattern document that covered 9 properties over 4 years. 9 separate incidents, each one explained away at the time as misfortune. Together, they formed a timeline of systematic destruction. On the ride home, Mason was quiet for a long time. The afternoon sky was high and cold and perfectly clear, the kind of sky that made Wyoming feel infinite. This is enough to present to the other ranchers, Hazel said. It's enough for them to understand what's been done to them. He kept his eyes on the road. Getting them to act on it is different. I know. Men who've been surviving alone don't easily agree to move together. I watched my father's business contacts scatter. When the trouble started, every one of them had a reason why it wasn't their fight. She was quiet for a moment. But the men here have something your father's business contacts didn't. What's that? Land, something physical they can lose. Abstract injustice is easy to walk away from. Watching your neighbor's barn burn down and knowing your barn might be next, that's harder to walk away from. Mason looked at her sideways. You're more strategic than you let on. I let on exactly as much strategy as the situation requires. The ghost of something that might have been a smile crossed her face and was gone. He looked back at the road. The meeting, he said. We'll need Eric to call it. They trust him more than they trust me. I've been too isolated. That's the first step, and I need one more thing before then. What? Access to the territorial land records in Sheridan, the official filings for all of Voss's county acquisitions. She paused. I need to see the prices. I think they're going to tell us something we're not expecting. The man arrived on the October 14th afternoon stage. Mason was in town for supplies when the stage came in, and he would have had no reason to notice the passenger in the dark coat who stepped down and looked around the station with the particular alertness of someone arriving for a specific purpose, except that Hazel had described Raymond Porter's general appearance to him, and this man fit it well enough to make Mason look twice. Medium height, 50 or so, with the careful eyes of someone trained to observe. A good coat that had seen considerable travel. He moved to the baggage handler with the ease of a man used to arriving in unfamiliar places. Mason finished loading his wagon, drove past the stage station without stopping, and rode home. He told Hazel that evening. She sat with it for a long moment. Her face was still, but her hands had gone very quiet around her coffee cup, the stillness of controlled response rather than actual calm. "You're certain it was him?" "No, I'm telling you, there's a man in Sheridan who arrived today and looks like what you described. Could be anyone. Could be." But he watched her turn it over in her mind, weighing possibilities. That was a thing he'd come to recognize about Hazel in the 3 weeks they'd been married. She didn't catastrophize, but she also didn't dismiss. She'd assessed. "If it's his porter," she said, bossing, "I need to know who hired him and what he's actually looking for, not just what Meridian Capital's official story says." She looked up. "Are there things in Sheridan that would draw a Chicago investigator for reasons other than finding me? Mining interests, land speculation?" "Voss has a local office," Mason said, "in the commercial building on 2nd Street. She looked at him. "Porter could be working for Voss. Or Porter could be working against Voss. You said you didn't know whose side he was on." "I don't." She was quiet for a moment. "I need to think about this." "Do that." He stood. "Whatever you decide, I meant what I said. If someone comes to this ranch looking for you, they find out you're my wife and this is your home." She looked at him steadily for a moment. "You say things and you mean them," she said. "It wasn't quite a compliment and wasn't quite an observation. That's," she stopped. "Unusual, increasingly rare." She looked back at her papers. "Go to bed, Mason. I'll figure this out." He went to bed. He did not sleep for a while. The meeting was called for October 22nd at the Haverson Barn, which was the largest neutral space available. Eric had ridden the circuit personally over 5 days, talking to every ranch family within 20 miles, and 11 families came. Hazel had prepared for 3 days. Not the meeting itself, the materials for the meeting. Summary pages for each ranch showing their own numbers compared to regional averages. The compiled incident timeline. The outline of Voss's acquisition pattern presented as a visual map on a large sheet of paper that Mason had mounted on the barn wall. She stood at the front of the gathered ranchers, 23 people, men and women both, because Ruth had made it clear that the women were coming and no one had argued with Ruth and spoke for 40 minutes. It was different from what she'd imagined the first time she'd pictured herself doing something like this. She had imagined resistance, crossed arms, the specific skepticism of people who distrust outsiders and newcomers. There was some of that, but mostly she saw recognition. That was the most powerful thing about showing people their own numbers. They couldn't argue with what they'd written down themselves. And when you put 12 sets of similar numbers next to each other and showed what they added up to, the arithmetic was unavoidable. A rancher named Douglas, who had the sun-damaged face of a man who'd spent 30 years outdoors and the eyes of someone who'd learned the hard way not to be surprised by cruelty, was the first to speak when she finished. "You're saying someone's been costing us money for 4 years, he said, deliberately. "Yes, the pricing pattern across all of your supply accounts is consistent with coordinated adjustment. The probability that this is coincidental is essentially zero. And Voss profits from it, how specifically? 2 ways. First, he's positioned as the buyer when the accumulated pressure finally makes selling look attractive. He pays below market because the market in this county has been artificially depressed. Second," she paused, "I believe he has a financial interest in at least one of the supply businesses that's been overcharging you. So he profits on both ends of the transaction." Douglas was quiet for a moment. "And the fires, Strand's cattle. I can't prove direct causation. What I can show is that in each case the incident occurred within 12 months of a Voss acquisition offer and was followed by a sale within 6 months of the incident. That's not proof, that's timing. In a court of law, no. In a pattern of 9 incidents with identical timing, it's something a judge would have difficulty dismissing." She held his gaze. "And it's something a newspaper will find very compelling." Douglas looked at Mason. Your wife brought this together. My wife brought this together, Mason said. A long pause in the barn. The wind moved against the walls. Someone's horse shifted in the corral outside. Then Douglas looked back at Hazel. What do you need from us? 3 days after the ranchers' meeting, Raymond Porter arrived at Coldwater Creek Ranch. Mason saw him coming from the upper pasture, a rider on the road moving at a deliberate pace. Not the pace of someone scouting trouble, but the pace of someone with an appointment. He rode down to meet him at the gate. Mason Cole. That's right. The man had the careful eyes Hazel had described. Raymond Porter, I was hoping to speak with your wife. About a legal matter in Chicago. I have some questions that she... My wife is busy, Mason said. What firm are you representing, Mr. Porter? A pause. I'm representing myself at the moment. I've recently separated from the Pinkerton agency. Mason studied him. Separated how? Porter met his eyes. He had Mason thought the look of a man who was accustomed to being evaluated and had learned to let it happen. I resigned 3 weeks ago. I was assigned to locate Mrs. Cole for a client I was subsequently informed was not Meridian Capital. When I discovered who the actual client was, I no longer wished to complete the assignment. The actual client. Mason felt something move in his chest, not quite surprise, more like the sensation of a piece falling into place. Voss, he said. Porter didn't answer immediately, which was itself an answer. Mr. Porter, Mason said, I'm going to invite you inside, but I want you to understand something first. Whatever you have to say to my wife, you say it with me present. And if at any point I decide the conversation is not in her interest, it ends. Porter looked at him steadily. That seems fair. They went inside. Hazel was at her table when they came through the door. She stood immediately, and Mason watched her face run through 3 things in the space of a second: recognition, wariness, and then something more complicated: assessment. Mr. Porter, she said. Mrs. Cole. He looked around the room, the ledgers, the summary pages, the Wyoming landscape visible through the east window, and something shifted in his expression. Not surprise, more like confirmation. You've been busy. Sit down, she said. Tell me who you were actually working for. Porter sat. He folded his hands on the table with the care of a man about to give testimony. Voss Consolidated retained the Pinkerton agency under a contract ostensibly held by Meridian Capital. The arrangement was designed to obscure Voss's involvement in your prosecution. The charges against you in Chicago are fabricated, as I assume you know. They were manufactured specifically to discredit the evidence you'd collected and to make it necessary for you to either surrender the evidence or disappear. Why are you here? Hazel said. Why tell me this? A pause. Because before I resigned, I made copies of the contract documents and the communications between Voss and the agency. I was going to deliver them to you, Mrs. Cole, not because I'm a particularly principled person, but because I have been watching what Voss does to people for 18 months, and I am no longer able to continue being part of it. He looked at her directly. And because I knew a man who worked in a Virginia mine. The room went very quiet. Thomas Cole, Mason said. His voice was perfectly steady. I knew of him, Porter said. I was a local deputy in that county when the collapse happened. I was one of the people who recorded the incident. I wrote in my report that the structural failure showed evidence of deliberate decommissioning old failing support timbers that should have been replaced months earlier. My report was amended before it went into the county record. The amended version said accidental failure due to geological instability. He looked at Mason. I left law enforcement in Virginia 2 years after the coal mine incident. I have thought about it on and off for 8 years. Mason did not speak. There was nothing to say that the room didn't already contain. What do the documents you brought prove? Hazel said. Her voice was very controlled. They prove Voss's involvement in manufacturing the charges against you. They corroborate the financial transfers you identified. I have internal communications that confirm the subsidiary structure was designed to launder land acquisition profits. He paused. They don't prove anything about the Virginia mine. That evidence no longer exists in any official record. But you were there, Mason said. I was there. Will you testify? Another pause. Longer this time. To federal authorities, yes. Not to a county court in Wyoming where the judicial appointments can be traced to Voss's political contributions. Federal level. I'll testify to what I saw and what was done to my report. Hazel looked at Mason. He looked at her. This was the moment he thought when a single investigation that had started as self-defense became something else. Something with momentum. Something that was going to be very difficult to stop once it started moving. He thought about Thomas. He looked at Hazel, at the careful steadiness of her face, and at what was underneath the steadiness, the grief she'd been carrying for years in a leather portfolio at the bottom of a carpet bag. "We'll need time," he said. "Hazel's been compiling the Wyoming land records. When she's done, we present everything together, Chicago, Wyoming, Virginia. If you'll testify to the federal land office and to the territorial governor simultaneously, not one piece at a time, all of it at once," Porter nodded slowly. "That's the right approach. Voss has enough connections that individual pieces can be suppressed. A complete case presented through multiple channels at the same time is harder to bury," Hazel said. "Yes, I've been thinking the same thing." Porter looked at her with something that might have been, if you were charitable, respect. "Mrs. Cole, I want to say," he stopped, started again. "I'm sorry I didn't do something sooner about your father. I didn't know about the Chicago operation at the time, but I knew about Voss, and you did what you needed to do to survive," she said. Not harshly, just accurately. "We all have years like that." She stood and went to the shelf where she kept the leather portfolio. She took it down and held it for a moment. Then she set it on the table and opened it. "Let me show you what I have," she said, "and you show me what you brought, and we'll see what we have together." Mason made coffee and stayed out of the way, and they worked through the afternoon while the October light moved across the floor and the Wyoming wind pushed against the walls, and he thought, this is what it looks like when someone stops running. 2 nights after Porter's visit, Mason couldn't sleep. He lay in the dark for an hour listening to the house settle and the wind move, and finally got up, pulled on his coat, and went out to the porch. The sky was extraordinary. Wyoming nights had shown him this repeatedly over 7 years, and he hadn't stopped being surprised by it, the sheer density of stars undimmed by city light, the Milky Way, a visible river of it above the black line of the ridge. The cold was clean and absolute. He sat on the porch step and looked at it. After a while, the door opened behind him. Hazel came out in her coat, her hair loose around her shoulders, carrying 2 cups. She handed him one without a word and sat down on the step beside him. Not close, a foot of space between them. Appropriate given what they were to each other, which was still technically 2 strangers who'd made a legal arrangement. But not far. They sat and looked at the sky. Neither of them spoke. This was the thing about silence Mason had been noticing. It had different textures. The silence of 2 people who had nothing to say was one thing. The silence of 2 people who had more to say than they knew how to start was another. And then there was the silence of 2 people who were simply present in the same moment, under the same sky, and didn't need the silence to be anything other than what it was. He didn't know how long they sat there. Long enough for the Big Dipper to move perceptibly, long enough for the cold to settle in properly, and for neither of them to feel like going inside. He thought about Thomas. He did that less frequently than he used to, and the grief had changed its shape over the years, sharper in some places, softer in others, but still present, still there. He thought about Hazel's father, about the letter she kept and never read. He thought about the meeting with Porter and the documents now spread across his kitchen table, and the case that was building itself from grief and evidence, and the particular stubbornness of people who refused to accept that powerful men simply got away with things. Eventually, Hazel stood. He heard her gather herself. "We should get some sleep," she said. "Tomorrow's going to be long." "It is." She went inside. He stayed a few minutes longer, finishing his coffee, listening to the silence. Tomorrow was going to be long. And after tomorrow, there would be another long day and another, and the work ahead was real and difficult, and there was no certainty it would succeed. But sitting on his porch in the dark, under those particular stars, with the cold air in his lungs, and the evidence of a life built by his own hands around him, and the sound of Hazel moving quietly inside the house, putting away the cups, banking the stove, Mason Cole felt something he hadn't felt in 7 years of fighting alone. Ready. The trouble came on a Thursday morning in early November, arriving in 3 parts. The first part was a rider from Douglas's place, arriving before breakfast with his horse lathered and his face tight. Douglas's equipment barn had burned overnight. No injuries. Douglas had smelled smoke in time, but the loss was total. Harnesses, tools, a new hay baler he'd bought in August. 4 months of a family's careful savings turned to ash. The second part was an official document from the Territorial Surveyor's Office, delivered to Mason that same morning by county deputy who had the particular expression of a man delivering news he would rather not be delivering. Harlan Voss had filed a formal boundary dispute claim alleging that Mason's east fence encroached 17 yards onto Voss consolidated property and in requesting an official survey to establish the correct line. The third part arrived that afternoon, a telegram from an attorney in Cheyenne notifying Mason that Voss Consolidated had filed a lawsuit claiming cattle trespass and alleging theft of 12 head of stock found bearing Voss brands in Mason's herd. The attorney noted that under territorial law, the case would be heard in the county court and suggested that early settlement might be advisable. Mason stood at the kitchen table and read all three things. Hazel was behind him. He heard her put down what she was doing and come to read over his shoulder. "He knows," she said. "He knows something. Maybe about the ranchers' meeting. Maybe Porter told him we were building a case." Mason set the papers down. Or maybe he was always going to escalate this month regardless. He's got the boundary dispute ready to file. He's got the cattle suit. The barn fire is a warning. Her voice was flat. He did the same thing in Chicago. When the legal pressure wasn't moving fast enough, he escalated to physical intimidation. The difference is that in Chicago, his targets were isolated and had no community around them. And here, she looked at him steadily. Here we have 11 ranch families who sat in a barn 2 weeks ago and agreed to share information and provide backup. That's different from anything he's faced before. She paused. But Douglas lost his equipment barn. That's a real loss that we have to respond to as well as fight Voss. Mason was already thinking, the association can cover equipment in the short term. We've been talking about a mutual aid fund. Now we have a reason to make it concrete. He looked at the telegram. The cattle trespass suit is fabricated. He doesn't have Voss brands in my herd, I'd know. But defending against it will cost money and time we don't have. Then we don't defend against it in the county court. He looked at her. What do you mean we don't play on his field? She was thinking rapidly. He could see it the way her eyes focused on something slightly beyond the immediate. We bring this to the federal level first, before the county court case gets started. If we file a complaint with the federal land office about the fraudulent boundary claim and submit the evidence we have about the cattle suit being harassment with Porter's testimony about the manufactured Chicago charges, we remove the jurisdictional advantage Voss has been relying on. That's a risk. Federal cases take time. Voss can do a lot of damage while we're waiting. Yes, but county courts can be bought. Federal courts are harder. She turned to face him fully. Mason, if we let him pull us into the county system, we're playing a game he's already rigged. He has the judge in his pocket. I found a payment record in Porter's documents, a wire transfer to a Judge Whitley in Sheridan from a Voss subsidiary in 1885 and again in 1887. Whitley handles all the land cases in this county. I know. Mason sat down. The November light came through the east window at a low angle and fell across the table, across the papers, across Hazel's hands, where she'd set them flat on the wood. You came here with a carpet bag and a leather portfolio, he said, and you've spent 6 weeks putting together a case that would take a law firm 6 months. I've been doing this work for 2 years, she said. Since before I left Chicago, I just didn't have a safe place to finish it. A pause. You gave me a safe place. He looked at her. She was looking at the papers. Hazel. She looked up. We're going to Cheyenne, he said. You, me, and Porter. The territorial governor's office first, then the federal land office. We present everything simultaneously. That's what I've been thinking. When can you have the case package complete? 4 days, maybe 3 if I don't sleep. You're sleeping. 4 days then. She pulled the papers toward her and began reorganizing. Tell Eric he needs to know what's coming, and I want him to have the ranchers on alert in case Voss moves against anyone else while we're gone. I'll go tonight. He stood, picked up his hat. At the door he stopped. Whatever happens in Cheyenne, he said, I want you to know. He stopped, tried again. You didn't have to tell me about your father. You didn't have to show me the portfolio. You could have done this alone. She looked at him steadily. The afternoon light made her face very clear. "So could you," she said. "You've been doing it alone for 7 years." "Yes." He held her gaze. "I've been doing it alone for 7 years. It goes better with two." He went to see Eric. The 4 days before they left for Cheyenne had a quality that Mason would remember afterward as both very long and very short, the particular compression of time that comes when the work in front of you is specific and finite, and everything depends on it being done right. Hazel worked. He had not seen anyone work the way Hazel worked in those 4 days. Not the brutal physical labor he knew, but a different kind of relentlessness. The relentlessness of a mind that refuses to rest until it has found the form that makes the truth impossible to ignore. She organized the case into 3 sections. The first was the Wyoming land records, 9 years of Voss acquisitions in Sheridan County, presented with the prices paid, the market values at time of purchase, and the incidents that preceded each purchase. Laid out in a table with Hazel's precise handwriting, the pattern was impossible to explain away. The second section was the Chicago material, the original wire transfer records, the subsidiary structure, documents the Meridian Capital internal communications that Porter had copied before resigning. Hazel had written a 20-page analysis connecting each document to a specific element of the larger scheme. The third section was Porter's testimony. He had written it out in full 8 pages, witnessed and notarized, covering the Virginia mine incident, the amended report, and his knowledge of the Voss-Pinkerton arrangement. On the third evening, she spread the completed sections across the table, and they went through it together, Mason reading, while she watched him making notes where something needed clarifying for a reader who didn't already know the background. He read for 2 hours. When he finished, he looked up. "This is enough to put him away," he said. "It's enough to force a serious federal investigation. Whether that investigation results in prosecution depends on whether the federal authorities choose to pursue it." She looked at him. "There are no guarantees." "I know." He looked at the pages. "But you couldn't have put this together from Chicago. You needed what was here, the ranch records, the rancher testimony, the Wyoming end of the pattern." He paused. "And I couldn't have built this case from here. I didn't have the Chicago end. I didn't have what Porter knows." "No, though." She was quiet for a moment. "Neither of us could have done this alone," he said. She met his eyes, looked at him for a long moment with that direct, careful gaze. "No," she said again, and something in her voice was different from the straightforward acknowledgement the word usually carried. Softer at the edges, or just more honest about what honesty felt like when it included more than documentation. He didn't push it. He closed the case package carefully and tied it with the cord Hazel had wound around it, and they went to bed at a reasonable hour for the first time in 4 days. The territorial capital was everything Sheridan wasn't: wide paved streets, electric lights in the commercial district buildings that aspired to permanence. They arrived on the evening train and checked into a hotel that was modest but adequate. Porter in a separate room down the hall. That night in the hotel dining room, they went over the presentation one final time. Porter was quieter than he'd been at the ranch, the particular quietness of a man who had made a decision and was waiting to find out what it cost. "If this gets suppressed at the territorial level," he said, "we need to be ready to go to the federal land commissioner directly. I have a contact there." "How good a contact?" Hazel asked. "Good enough that he won't be able to ignore documentation of this quality." Porter looked at the case package on the table between them. "The question is whether the governor's office engages with it seriously before Voss's people find out we're here. How much time do we have before they know about less than we'd like?" He looked at Mason. "Voss has a man in the territorial capital. I know who he is. I don't know if he's already been alerted." Mason thought about it. "Then we go to the governor's office first thing tomorrow morning. We don't give them time to prepare. That means we need to be at the door when it opens." 8 o'clock, Hazel said. "Yes." They were at the door at 7:50. The morning was cold and clear, the Cheyenne streets already beginning to move with the activity of a city waking up. Mason stood on the sidewalk in front of the territorial government building and looked at the stone facade and felt the particular feeling of standing at a point where things might change, might, depending on what happened in the next hour. He felt Hazel beside him. Not touching, just present. "Ready," he said. "I've been ready," she said, "for quite a while." They went in. The The governor's secretary tried to turn them away twice. The first time Hazel placed Porter's notarized testimony on the man's desk and said quietly that they had documentation of judicial corruption at the county level and land fraud at the territorial level and would prefer to share it with the governor directly, but that if that wasn't possible, the Denver Post territorial correspondent would be equally receptive to the material. The secretary looked at the document, looked at Hazel, looked at Mason. "I'll see if the governor has a few minutes," he said. Governor Harrington was 60, built like a former soldier, gone to administrative weight with shrewd eyes, in the manner of a man who had seen many things and was working to determine quickly which category this fell into. He listened for 45 minutes. He asked questions, precise, pointed questions, that told Mason he was actually reading the documents as when Hazel walked him through them, not just appearing to. He asked Porter 3 direct questions about the Virginia testimony and wrote down the answers himself. When Hazel finished presenting, there was a long silence. "You understand," Harrington said, "that Voss Consolidated is a significant investor in territorial infrastructure, roads, the new rail extension." "I understand that," Hazel said. "I also understand that territorial officials who ignore documented evidence of fraud tend to find those decisions scrutinized at federal election time." Mason watched Harrington assess her. The assessment took about 3 seconds. "I'll need to keep these documents," Harrington said. "Copies only. I assume you have originals." "We have originals and additional copies deposited with an attorney in Sheridan and with a contact at the federal land office," Hazel said. "The material is already in multiple hands." Something shifted in Harrington's face, something that might, in a man with less practiced control of his expression, have looked like relief. "You've done this before." "I've thought about it carefully." He looked at Mason. "The boundary dispute and the cattle suit both filed in Sheridan County." "Whitley's court," Mason said. "I have documentation suggesting Whitley has received payments from Voss subsidiaries." Harrington's expression changed into something definite. He pressed a button on his desk. His secretary appeared. "Send for Henderson. Tell him I need the Territorial Fraud Investigation Unit in my office within the hour." He looked back at Mason and Hazel. "I'm going to ask you to stay in Cheyenne for 2 days. I'll want you available for preliminary interviews." He looked at Porter. "You understand that your testimony about the Virginia incident will be forwarded to the appropriate federal authorities." "I understand," Porter said. "That's why I came." Harrington nodded once. "I don't promise anything," he said, "except that I'll pursue this." When they walked out of the building 2 hours later into the cold Cheyenne morning, Mason stopped on the sidewalk and stood for a moment with his face turned up to the pale sun. He felt Hazel stop beside him. He heard her exhale a long, slow breath, the kind that releases something that's been held for a very long time. "It's not over," she said. "No, it's just started." He looked at her. "But it's started." She looked at him for a moment. Then she put her hand through his arm, the first time she had ever touched him, in that way deliberate and present, and they walked back to the hotel together. The escalation came 8 days after they returned from Cheyenne. Mason was in the south pasture checking on a heifer when he heard the shots. Not hunting shots, the particular cadence of men shooting at something that could shoot back. 2 shots from the northwest, then silence, then one more. He was mounted and riding before he'd consciously made the decision to go. He found Ray Porter in the narrow canyon trail that connected the main road to the northern range, his horse lamed and standing badly, Porter himself behind a rock with a bleeding arm and a rifle in his good hand. 3 riders disappearing over the northern ridge. Mason dismounted, looked at the arm. Not life-threatening, but real. "Can you ride double?" "I can manage." Porter's face was pale but controlled. "They weren't trying to kill me. Warning shot, then they hit the horse. They wanted to disable me, which means someone knows what I'm carrying." "The depositions." "The depositions." Porter looked at his horse. "The copies I was bringing to Sheridan for filing. They know about those." "Means Voss has someone at the governor's office." Mason helped Porter to his feet. "Or at the attorney we deposited with." "Or both." Porter's jaw was tight. "I still have the documents. They didn't get close enough to take them." They rode double back to the ranch. Hazel cleaned and bound the arm with the practical efficiency of someone who dealt with worse, in less comfortable circumstances. He'd gathered from fragments of things she'd said that her farm childhood had included a fair number of injuries, and Porter sat at the table and held himself still while she worked. They know we're building the WEMP, he said. Whoever Voss has in Cheyenne has been reporting back. Then we accelerate, Hazel said. She tied the last bandage. We don't give them time to adjust. The federal contact you mentioned, can you reach him by telegraph today? Today, yes. Then do it. Not the documents, just a message saying we're ready to transfer the material and requesting a meeting date in the next 10 days. She looked at Mason. And I want to talk to Tom Aldred at the Gazette. I thought we were going to the Denver Post. We are, but Aldred's been wanting to write this story for 2 years. If we give him the Wyoming angle, simultaneously, the local paper, and the Denver Post on the same day, Voss can't suppress one without the other being already out. Mason thought about it. When, after the federal meeting, we time everything together. She stood back and looked at Porter. You are staying here tonight. You can ride tomorrow. Porter looked mildly surprised by being told what he was doing. All right. I made stew, she added. It's on the stove. She went back to her papers. Porter looked at Mason with the expression of a man recalibrating his assessment of a situation he thought he understood. She's something, Porter said quietly. She is, Mason agreed. It was the night after Porter's attack and the house was quiet. Porter was asleep in the front room. Mason had checked the perimeter twice and added a bar to the barn door. Hazel had stayed up late with her papers, and when Mason came in from the second perimeter check, she was finally putting the last documents away. He poured them both water and sat down across from her. He's going to come harder now, Mason said. Yes. The next move won't be warning shots and property damage. He knows the case is close. When a man like Voss is cornered, he doesn't see himself as cornered. She looked at her hands. I've been thinking about how he thinks. Men like Voss never see themselves as the aggressor. They see themselves as the ones maintaining order against people who don't understand how the world works. A pause. My father didn't understand that. He thought there were rules and that the rules protected people who followed them. He found out that the rules are written by people like Voss. Mason was quiet. The letter, he said, that you keep. Her hands stilled. You don't have to tell me, he said quickly. I'm not asking because He apologized, she said. Her voice was very steady. 3 sentences. He apologized to my mother, who had been dead for 2 years by then. He apologized to my brother, who he said had done nothing wrong. And he apologized to me for not being the kind of man who found a way to fight. She looked at the table. 3 sentences, and all of them were apologies, and not one of them was angry, and I have been angry on his behalf for 9 years because he wasn't. Your father was a good man, Mason said. Good men often aren't angry enough. I know. She looked up at him. I'm angry enough for both of us. I have been for a long time. He looked at her, at the precision of her grief, at the long years of carrying it alone, at the way she'd turned it into something that might actually change something. That anger, he said, you put it into the work. It was either that or let it eat me. A pause. My mother let it eat her. She had reasons, 2 different ones, but real. She was a woman who sacrificed everything she was for duty and propriety and what the neighbors thought, and when the duty and the propriety and the neighbors all turned out to be as fragile as everything else, there was nothing left for her to be. She looked at him directly. I decided when I was 20 years old that I would not be that woman, that I would be angry out loud and use the anger for something. It worked better in some years than in others. It's working now. It's working now. Something softened in her expression, not weakness, but the particular quality of strength that is secure enough to show its edges. You've given me room to work, Mason. Since the first night when you went to the window so I could say the hard thing and not feel watched. You've given me room. He looked at her. I don't know how to give less than that. I know. She held his gaze. That's what I mean. They sat with it for a moment, the thing that had been building between them for 6 weeks, unnamed and present, taking up space in every room of the house in the way that something real does when it hasn't been acknowledged yet. Mason thought, say it or don't, but don't pretend it isn't there. I told you I wasn't looking for romance, he said. I know you did. I wasn't when I sent that telegram. That was true. I know it was. It's less true now. He said it simply the way he said everything that mattered. What I feel about you is not the arrangement that we agreed to. I don't know when that changed. Somewhere between the first time you reorganized my ledgers and the night you sat on the porch and didn't need me to fill the silence." Hazel was very still for a moment. "I'm not good at this," she said. The other part of it. I've spent a long time being good at work and being careful about everything else." "I know that. I'm telling you because I want you to know I'm not being cautious because I don't feel anything. I'm being cautious because I've learned that what feels like solid ground sometimes isn't." "I know what you mean," he said. "I've also learned that." She looked at him for a long moment. "I feel things," she said. "About this." A pause. "About you, I have for a while. I've just been waiting to be certain I wasn't—" She stopped. "Wasn't what?" "Wasn't feeling them because I needed someone and you were there." She looked at him steadily. "I needed you to be real to me before I let myself trust the feeling. Does that make sense?" "It makes sense. You're real to me," she said. "You have been for a while." The fire in the stove crackled. Outside, the November wind moved across the property with its particular Wyoming sound, high and clean and permanent. Mason reached across the table and put his hand over hers. She looked at his hand. Then she turned hers over and held it. That was all. That was enough. The meeting with the federal land commissioner's representative took place in Cheyenne on November 28th, 3 weeks after the governor's meeting, 2 weeks after Porter's attack on the trail. The federal representative's name was Crawford, and he was unlike Harrington in almost every way, younger, quieter, with the manner of a man who had been processing paperwork his entire career and had developed a deep and genuine respect for documentation. He read the case package from the beginning, asked 17 questions, and when he was done, asked for another hour to review Porter's deposition separately. When he came back, he said, "This is sufficient to open a federal investigation into land fraud, market manipulation, and racketeering across 3 states." 3 states. Mason hadn't known until that moment how far the pattern reached beyond Virginia and Wyoming and Chicago. "How long will the investigation take?" Hazel asked. "That depends on cooperation from the relevant states and the scope of what we find as we dig." Crawford looked at her directly. "You understand that you'll be witnesses. You'll need to be available for the duration." "We're available," she said. "The charges against you in Chicago," he looked at his notes, "will be suspended pending the investigation. If the investigation confirms what's documented here, they'll be formally dismissed." He looked at Porter. "Your testimony about the amended Virginia report will be transferred to the appropriate federal authority in that jurisdiction." Porter nodded once. That afternoon, Hazel sent word to Tom Aldred at the Sheridan Gazette and to the Denver Post territorial correspondent. The message was simple. The federal investigation had been opened. The documentation was available. They would speak tomorrow. The stories ran on December 2nd, Aldred's in the Sheridan Gazette, the Denver Post piece covering the territorial scope, and a third story in the Chicago Tribune that Porter had arranged through a contact covering the Meridian capital charges. By December 5th, 3 additional federal subpoenas had been issued. By December 10th, Harlan Voss had retained 4 different attorneys and was not his spokesman, said available for comment. He came anyway. Not in person. Mason would give him that much, that he didn't come personally. He sent 3 men on a cold December morning, and the only warning was the sound of horses in the yard. Mason was already at the window. Hazel was behind him, and she had the Winchester before he'd reached for the door. 3 riders. He recognized 2 of them, Voss's ranch foreman and a man who'd been at the county court the day the cattle trespass suit was filed. The third was a lawyer Mason guessed from the way he sat his horse. He went to the porch. "Cole," the foreman's voice was careful, stripped of the usual aggression. "Mr. Voss is prepared to settle all pending litigation. He'll drop the boundary dispute and the cattle suit and compensate the ranchers for—" He checked a paper for documented losses resulting from supply chain irregularities. "In exchange for withdrawal of all federal complaints and the return of the documentary evidence." Mason stood on his porch and looked at these men. Behind him through the open door, he could hear the sound of Hazel's pen stop moving. "The federal investigation has already been opened," Mason said. "The documentation is in federal custody. We don't have the authority to withdraw it." The foreman's jaw tightened. Mr. Voss should have thought about this before he burned Douglas's barn," Mason said, "and before he had those men put 3 bullets near Ray Porter on the North Canyon Road." A silence. "I can't speak to go home," Mason said. "Go home, Mason." He said it quietly. "Tell Voss that what he did to Joseph Strand and the Kemper family and the Brennan homestead is a matter of federal record. Tell him what he did to Thomas Cole in a Virginia mine in 1879 is a matter of federal record. Tell him what he did to James Donnelly's accounting firm in Chicago in 1881 is a matter of federal record." He held the foreman's eyes. "There's no settlement that changes those records now. They're already where they need to be." The foreman looked at him for a long moment. Then he turned his horse and they rode out. Mason stood on the porch until they were past the gate and disappearing down the road. Then he came back inside. Hazel was standing in the middle of the room, the Winchester in her hands, her face composed and still in the way he'd learned to read as its most honest expression. "It's not over," she said. "No." He looked at her. "But it's different now. He's on defense. That's new." When she set the Winchester down on the table carefully with the attention she gave to everything, then she sat down. He sat across from her. "Thomas Cole," she said quietly. "You said his name out loud." "Yes." "How did that feel?" He thought about it, about the particular quality of saying a name out loud that you've been carrying silently for years. "Like something," he said, "like something that needed to be said." She reached across the table and put her hand flat on the wood between them, not reaching for his just present. He put his hand over hers. They sat like that for a while. The federal indictment came in March of 1888. Harlan Voss was charged on 14 counts land fraud across 3 states. Market manipulation, conspiracy to commit arson, conspiracy to commit property theft, and 2 counts of obstruction of justice. His attorney entered a not guilty plea on all counts. The trial was set for September. The Sheridan County Court dismissed both the boundary dispute and the cattle trespass suit against Mason on the same day the indictment was announced, with a terse note from the court citing insufficient evidence. Judge Whitley resigned from the bench 2 weeks later, citing health reasons. The Chicago charges against Hazel were formally dismissed in April, accompanied by a 2-sentence acknowledgement from the Illinois Attorney General's office that the original complaint had been filed on the basis of manufactured evidence. She read the dismissal letter twice. Then she set it on the table face down and went back to the ranch's spring accounts. "That's it?" Mason asked. "That's it." He looked at her. "I thought I'd feel," she stopped, "different at more. I've been working toward this for 2 years. She looked at the letter face down on the table. "But the letter doesn't give my father's firm back. It doesn't give back the 4 years he spent fighting the charges. It doesn't," she stopped again. He didn't say anything. He moved his chair next to hers and sat with her, and she leaned against him slightly, just her shoulder against his arm, and they looked at the face-down letter together. "It's not enough," she said. "It never could be, but it's what there is." "Yes. And Voss will be convicted." Not a question, a conclusion drawn from the evidence, as she drew everything from evidence. "Very likely, yes." She nodded, sat up straight again, reached across and flipped the dismissal letter face up. "All right," she said. "Now I can set it down." The trial was in September as scheduled. They went to Cheyenne for 3 weeks to give testimony, and the hotel was better this time, and Porter joined them on the 2nd week, his arm long since healed. Crawford turned out to be good at his work in a courtroom, as well as in a federal office, and Hazel's documentation was entered into evidence with the appreciation of someone who understood what meticulous work looked like. Harlan Voss was convicted on 11 of 14 counts. He was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. In the courtroom, as the verdict was read, Mason watched Hazel's face. She was very still. Then she exhaled that same long, slow breath he'd first heard on the sidewalk in Cheyenne, and looked at the ceiling for a moment. He reached over and took her hand. She held it. Spring came to Coldwater Creek Ranch on a Tuesday in April of 1889, and it came with the particular generosity of Wyoming springs, sudden and absolute, like a decision finally made. The creek was running high from snowmelt. The willows along the bank were showing their first green. The horses were restless in the corral, wanting to run, and Mason let them into the upper pasture and stood at the fence watching them go. He heard Hazel's step on the porch behind him. She came and stood beside him, a coffee cup in each hand. She'd taken to carrying 2 cups so naturally that he'd stopped noticing it until he thought about what it signified, the simple, practiced knowledge that he would be somewhere nearby and would want one. Eric's coming Thursday, she said. Ruth wants to plan the spring association meeting. The Iron Creek, or rather the Coldwater Creek Cattlemen's Association, had grown over the winter. 7 more ranches had joined after the Voss indictment once it became clear that the collective approach had produced what 7 years of individual effort hadn't. Hazel ran the administrative side with the same precision she brought to everything, and Mason handled the coordination work, the riding between ranches, the mediating, the thankless organizational labor he'd once avoided, because it required exactly the kind of trust in other people that had seemed dangerous. It still required that. He'd found somewhere in the past year that it was less dangerous than he'd thought, or that the danger was worth accepting. Porter wrote, Hazel said. He's found work with the Federal Land Office in Denver. He sounds like a man who's found a use for himself. Good. A silence. The horses moved in the upper pasture, bright against the April green. Mason. Yes. I've been thinking about the letter. She was looking at the pasture, not at him. My father's letter. I've been carrying it for 4 years. I keep it because... She stopped. I kept it because letting go of it felt like letting go of something I owed him. Like carrying it was a kind of accounting. A pause. I don't think that's right anymore. I think he'd want me to set it down. He waited. I'm not going to burn it, she said. I'll keep it in the portfolio with the rest of the documents. But I'm going to stop reading it. She finally looked at him. Does that make sense? Yes, he said. It makes complete sense. She nodded once and looked back at the horses. The spring air moved around them. Somewhere above the ridge, a hawk was making its morning circuit. There's something else, Hazel said, and her voice had changed still, even but with something underneath the evenness that made him turn to look at her. She was looking at the ranch, the house, the barn, the creek, the mountains, taking it in with the particular attention she brought to things that mattered. I came here because I had to, she said. That was true. I've never pretended otherwise. She looked at him. But I'm staying because I want to. That's different. I want you to know that's different. He looked at her for a long moment. I know it's different, he said. Good. She handed him his coffee cup. Because I have plans for this ranch. The south field, the one you have been leaving fallow, I think we can irrigate it from the creek if we dig the ditch 20 feet east. It would add 40 acres of viable pasture. That's a significant project. We have a significant ranch. She looked at him steadily with that direct gaze that saw things clearly and reported them accurately. We built it together. We might as well plan it together. He thought about 7 years of working alone, about the particular silence of a house that only one person lived in, the kind of silence that became invisible because you stopped noticing it. About the morning he had walked into a lawyer's office, believing that the worst thing possible was losing a piece of land. About how wrong he had been about what could be lost and what could be built. Yes, he said, let's plan it together. Above them, the hawk completed its circuit and dove toward the high grass, certain and direct. The creek ran over the old stones of its bed, carrying snowmelt from the mountains, patient, persistent, finding its way through every obstacle by the simple discipline of continuing. The spring grew around them. 10 years after, on the autumn afternoon of their 10th anniversary, Mason and Hazel Cole stood in the upper pasture of Coldwater Creek Ranch, while their son and daughter ran at the creek's edge, trying to catch the last of the season's grasshoppers. The son was 8, quiet and observant, with his mother's analytical eyes in his father's face. The daughter was 6, fearless and loud, and she had already informed her parents that she intended to manage the ranch accounts when she was old enough, a declaration both of them had received with the appropriate seriousness. The herd had grown to 380 head. The south field irrigated exactly as Hazel had planned. The association met quarterly and had developed a collective marketing arrangement that had, over the decade, fundamentally changed what it meant to be a small rancher in Sheridan County. Ruth Halverson had organized the Women's Auxiliary 2 years after Hazel arrived, and it had outgrown its original purpose and become something more like a mutual aid organization that covered medical costs, school supplies, and anything else the community needed that individual families couldn't carry alone. Hazel served as its treasurer. She served as the association's secretary. She had over 10 years quietly become the organizing intelligence behind most of what worked well in the county, in the same way that certain structures become load-bearing without anyone formally designating them as such. She was also still and always a woman who brought 2 cups of coffee when she knew Mason was somewhere nearby and would want one. He thought about this as they stood in the upper pasture watching their children, about the strange, precise accounting of a life. What you lose, what you build, what you discover costs less and more than you expected, and what turns out to be the only currency that matters. Do you regret it? He asked. The question they'd been asking each other on anniversaries, a ritual they'd started on the second year, and kept because the answer kept being true. She looked at the ranch, the house, the barn, the creek, the mountains, her children running at the water's edge. Every year I think about that question, she said. And every year the answer gets further from where I started. She looked at him. I came here with a carpet bag and a leather portfolio and a plan to hide until I was safe enough to fight. I didn't come here expecting. She gestured a small, encompassing motion. This. Neither did I. No. She was quiet for a moment. I regret my father. I regret that Thomas didn't live to see Voss convicted. I regret the years I spent making myself smaller, so no one would see how angry I was. She looked at him. I don't regret a single day here. He put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him. The ease of 10 years, the particular comfort of a person who has become the shape your life fits around. Neither do I, he said. Across the pasture, their daughter caught a grasshopper and held it up triumphantly, calling to her brother in a voice that carried across the Wyoming air. The mountains stood as they always stood. The creek ran as it always ran. They had built this, the two of them, from separate griefs and separate necessities. In a telegram, in 30 days, in the slow accumulation of days, when they had chosen without always naming it to trust each other one more time. It was not, Mason thought, an easy thing they had built. Easy things didn't last in Wyoming. It was a true thing. That was better.